I want to say good morning to each and every one of you and welcome Second Nazareth Baptist Church family and friends. It's good to see you this morning, and I'm just excited about this lesson because this is getting to the end of the book of Matthew, but it's during the last week of Jesus's life. And although it seems like a lot because it's spread over a couple of chapters, this stuff is rapidly moving as we um, are nearing the end of the story that Matthew has for us concerning Jesus as the Messiah and as a king. And so basically, this is going to be interesting. We'll work through the material so that we'll be able to understand it in context and have a couple of things that we point out as we go. So let's look at the 24th chapter of the book of Matthew. And welcome, 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 welcome. Let's look at Matthew 24 and let's do what we do and get that done. I pray that all have been having a great week. And so let's look at Matthew chapter 24. All right. And Jesus went out, Matthew 24, and King James Version. And Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him for to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? And Jesus answered and said unto them, Take heed that no man deceive you. For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in divers places. All these are the beginnings of the sorrow. Then they shall deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you. And ye shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. And then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another. And many false prophets shall rise, and shall deceive many. And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. But he that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. Neither let him which is in the field turn back to take his clothes. And woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. Pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. For then shall be great tribulation, such as not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And except those days be shortened, there should be no flesh saved. For the elect's sake those days shall be shortened. Then if any man shall say unto you, Lo, here is Christ, or there, believe it not. For there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect. Behold, I have told you before. Wherefore, if they shall say unto you, Behold, he is in the desert, go not forth. Behold, he is in the secret chambers. believe it not. For as the lightning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. For wheresoever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered. Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven shall be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Now learn a parable of the fig tree. When his branch is tender and putteth forth leaves, ye know that summer is nigh. So likewise, when you see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away. But of that day or hour knoweth no man, not the angel of heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of Noah, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in those days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered into the ark, and knew not until the floods came and took them all away. So shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Then shall two be in the field, then one shall be taken and the other one left. Two women shall be grinding at the mill, the one shall be taken and the other left. Watch therefore, for ye know not what hour your Lord doth come. But know this, that if the good man of the house had known in what watch the thief would come, he would have watched and would have not have suffered his house to be broken up. Therefore be ye also ready, for in such an hour as ye think not the Son of Man cometh. Who then is a faithful and wise servant, whom his Lord had made ruler of his household, to give them meat in due season? Blessed is a servant whom his Lord, when he cometh, shall find so doing. Verily I say unto you, that he shall make him ruler over all his goods. And if that evil servant shall say in his heart, my Lord delayeth his coming, and shall begin to smite his fellow servants, and to eat and drink with the drunken, the Lord of that servant shall come in a day when he looketh not for him, and in the hour that he is not aware of, and shall cut him asunder, and appoint him his portion with the hypocrites. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. I know that is a lot to digest, but I wanted you to get the gist of this passage in its entirety, so that we can start to pick apart this enormous task, this great verse, or these great verses in chapter 24 and 25. They are like a package deal, and we're going to work on them one by one. So with that being said, let's stop sharing this particular tab, and let's go to work on deciphering what all of this means to us, how we can apply it to our lives, and then talk a little bit about the things that are in the great tribulation at the end of the age. So turn that off, and here we are. All right. So Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said to them, do you not see all these things? I assuredly say unto you that not one stone shall be left here upon the other, that thou shalt be thrown down. Let me give you the background for this. Well, chapters 24 and 25 of Matthew are known as the Olivet Discourse. And it was named because these pronouncements were given on the Mount of Olives. This is one of the passages that is entirely prophetic. It points forward to the tribulation period, and it also points to the Lord's second coming. It primarily, though not exclusively, concerns the nation of Israel, and these words were spoken, and what they're referring to is the land of Palestine. So how do we know? Because in chapter 24, verse 16 of Matthew, it talks about the nation of Israel. Those who are in Judea flee into the mountains. So the setting is distinctly Jewish. Pray that your flight may not be on the Sabbath day. So we know that they're speaking to the Jews. In Matthew 24 and 22, they're talking about the elect of God, and it should be understood as Jewish people are the Jewish elect and not the church. The church, as we know it, is not found in either the prophecies or the parables of this particular discourse, and we shall and that is something that we'll demonstrate over time. But Jesus introduces this dialogue, these pronouncements, by departing from the temple. When he leaves from the temple, basically, Jesus had just uttered the words, "Your house is left to you desolate." It's a reminder of what Ezekiel had said when the glory departed from the temple. Jesus is like, look, I'm gone. These religious leaders have rejected me, and I'm wiping the dust off my feet. I'm never coming back to the temple. So he went out and he departed. He was going away, and he did not mean to return. He was through, and he was done fooling around with the Pharisees and the scribes, the chief priests. He was done with them because they had rejected him. After all, he cried over them. And so the disciples came and said, "Look at all these beautiful buildings, Jesus. Look at the beautiful building." Herod the Great, who ruled when Jesus was born, had built or rebuilt the temple, which was originally built by Zerubbabel after Solomon's temple was destroyed. Now, what I really want y'all to understand, they come to show him the temple. Herod the Great did some wonderful things in expanding the temple after Augustus had made him the king of basically the Jews. This is what he does. He makes Herod the king, and he is basically a puppet that would be accountable to Augustus. But Herod set out to build this temple, and the temple is the center of Jewish life for almost 1,000 years. So much so that it was customary for the Jews to swear by the temple And speaking against the temple could actually be considered blasphemy. So I want y'all to understand that the temple was the center of Jewish life. Everything emanated from the temple. And I want you to think about it. This temple is so special that everything that the Jews did, this was the center of their lives. Imagine during our times when the church was the center of everything we did. We played at the church. We had cookouts at the church, fish fries at the church, all day long service. On Saturday, we would do fun things. And on Sunday, we would come together and have great celebrations, feeding people out of our trunks and things of that nature. Having the brothers barbecue and fry fish and stuff like that. We put out the tables and chairs. The children are running around playing. The church was the center of our lives. During the civil rights movement, the church was a revealed strength that had grown from hush harbors and brush arbors where we went and stilled away to worship during slave days. That meant so much to us. God was the main thing. And instead of being a spoke on the wheel, God was the wheel. He was the middle of the wheel. And this is the way it was for the Jews. It took 8 years to build Herod's temple, 10,000 men working on it. It succeeded the beauty of Solomon's temple. And after Herod's work, the temple was 500 yards long, 400 yards wide. He started in 19 BC and completed it in 63 AD. That took more than 80 years. And the temple was only finished 7 years before it was destroyed. This second temple wasn't big, but it was beautiful. And that's the one that Zerubbabel and Ezra built. But they wanted Jesus to look at these buildings. They wanted him to look at the beautiful buildings, and Jesus told them to turn around and just take a good look at these things. The disciples were admiring the buildings. And Jesus says, but guess what? Not one stone shall be left standing on the other. As a matter of fact, 40 years after Jesus makes this utterance, there was a widespread Jewish revolution against the Romans in Palestine. They enjoyed many early successes, the Jews did, but ultimately the power of the Roman soldiers and the Roman war machine crushed those that rebelled. And in AD 70 or 70 AD, Jerusalem was leveled to the ground. The temple was destroyed, just as Jesus said that it would happen. Titus, it was said, would have preserved the temple as one of the world's wonders from being burnt, but he couldn't because the soldiers got drunk with rage and got wild, and they set the temple. One of these drunk soldiers started a fire, and it engulfed the whole building. Now, part of this is God's judgment, y'all, and they were not saved from this. But as the temple burned, the gold that was surrounded melted. The destruction was so complete that the Roman commander basically dismantled the whole temple stone by stone, and the destruction was so complete that they have real difficulty today knowing exactly where the temple foundation rested. The stones were white and strong, 50 feet long, 24 inches across, and 16 inches thick. This temple was really destroyed. But this is the punishment that also came when we build beautiful cathedrals and beautiful buildings. But if those buildings don't operate a house of God, then we're in violation and it's subject to destruction. When we reject Christ, reject his teachings, reject the love for people, the building is nothing. We put all this stuff in buildings, but it's not about the buildings. It's not about acquiring more buildings. It's really about doing what you do with what you have and training God's people to go out and be the best Christians that we could be. Spiritual transformation tells me that in order for me to be in spiritual shape, I've got to have a change of heart, receive Christ, and then do his work. And so, since this building was the center of Jewish life, God is basically saying, by destroying the temple, since you have removed me from being the center of your life, I'm going to remove this temple, which is a testimony and monument and house where my presence comes to dwell among you. In other words, God says, I'm out. I'm distancing myself. I love you, but I got to get some distance. And this is very significant. How little God values splendid houses of worship when they are made a den of thieves, as Jesus had told us. And so as he sat on the Mount of Olives, removed from the temple, yet he's overlooking the temple, the disciples asked Jesus questions about his prediction concerning the construction of the temple. When will these things be? And what will be a sign of your coming at the end of the age? I think it would do us some good if y'all would. Let's look at Solomon's temple and look at the facts of the temple. I want you to see the significance of the temple and why the temple is considered the center of Jewish life before we continue, as something that we should explore. So let's explore Herod's temple. Interesting facts of Herod's temple. I think that this will bring some eyes on this, and let's talk about the splendor so you can get some understanding of this temple and why this is significant in this passage to understand Herod's temple.
Herod's temple. King Herod wanted to create for the Jews a temple more magnificent than Solomon's, and by doing this he would perpetuate his name and secure Jerusalem as his capital and one of the greatest cities in the world. So in 23 BC, 7 years after Augustus had confirmed Herod as king of Judea, he takes on the task. Herod was one of the greatest architects in history, and for a project this great, he employed 18,000 skilled workers. The Jews agreed only because Herod said that his skilled craftsmen would train 1,000 of their priests to work on special religious areas of the temple. The foundations of the old temple were removed and the work had begun. Herod greatly enlarged the platform, and for the temple he used the basic floor plan of the Temple of Solomon, but its architecture was Hellenistic and Roman. He doubled the height of the Holy of Holies building and adorned every side of the main temple building with heavy gold plate. Josephus said it achieved magnificence beyond compare. He also said that at sunrise it shimmered with the utmost brilliance and dazzled the eye like rays of the sun. Herod used massive white stone blocks that were approximately 40 feet long by 18 feet wide and weighing hundreds of tons each. The construction of the temple was completed in only a year and a half, but the finished work lasted until 63 AD. The temple of Herod was the temple that is mentioned throughout the entire New Testament, and the one Jesus referred to as my Father's house. Its location was the same as Solomon's on Mount Moriah at the east side of Jerusalem. Just outside the eastern gate was the Valley of Jehoshaphat, or the Kidron Valley, and then across the valley was the Mount of Olives. The temple was made up of several large courtyards, each on a higher terrace and accessible by elaborate stairs and enormous gates. The first court, or outer court, was referred to as the court of the Gentiles, because Gentiles, or non-Jews, could come there to worship, but no further, lest they die. It was a beautiful courtyard surrounded by pillars of finely carved Corinthian marble. There was an area on the east side called Solomon's Porch, which was believed to have survived from the first temple and where Jesus did much of his teaching. It was here at the court of the Gentiles that Jesus drove out the money changers and traders from the temple and condemned the religious leaders of Jerusalem, saying, "Just stop making my Father's house a house of merchandise." Ascending higher, the next court was the court of the Israelites, which was divided into a court for men and a court for women. The treasury was also located here. Ascending higher again, the next court was the court of the priests, where the altar of burnt offering was located and the sacrifices were made. Blessings were given and psalms were chanted. Ascending 12 more steps led to the holy temple itself, the house of God. This rectangular building was the most beautiful part of the temple, and inside a veil was the larger room called the holy place, with the golden menorah, the table of the showbread, and the altar of incense. Inside the last veil was a smaller room called the Holy of Holies, where the high priest entered on the Day of Atonement to sprinkle the blood on behalf of the sins of the people of Israel. The blood was sprinkled on a special rock ever since the first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC and the Ark of the Covenant disappeared. Herod's temple was one of the architectural marvels of the ancient world, yet after its destruction by the Romans in 70 AD, almost nothing remains, and there is no way to know just how magnificent it really was.
All right. So we get an idea of what uh, Herod's temple looked like. Now, this is the temple that Jesus said that not one stone will be left on another. The disciples wanted Jesus to admire the architectural beauty of the temple, and they were occupied with the transient instead of the eternal. They were concerned with shadows rather than with substance. And so Jesus warned them, look, this building is going to be so completely destroyed that one stone would not be left on top of the other. And that's the bottom line. This is a prophecy of Christ, but it's also judgment. When the fire melted down and got so hot it melted down the gold trim, the molten metal, like I said, went between the stones, and the soldiers had to remove the stones one by one just to get the gold out. They did that. This is just as Jesus predicted. Romans sacked Jerusalem. So Jesus, when he crossed over that Mount of Olives, the disciples came and came to him privately and asked him three questions. Primarily three questions. When are these things going to happen? When would the temple be destroyed? We want to know. What would be the sign of his coming? They also wanted to know what supernatural events would precede his return to earth to set up the earthly kingdom, right? And then what would be the sign of the end of the age? This question, when are you coming back to rule and reign? Now, we got to understand that these disciples are Jews and that their thinking revolved around the glorious age of the Messiah on earth. They were not thinking about Christ coming for the church. They probably didn't know anything about the church or about that phase of his coming. But their expectation was that he would come in power, and he was coming in power and glory to destroy his enemies and rule over the world. And I want us to be clear that they were not talking about the end of the world, but the end of the age. So they weren't talking about the end of the world, the end of the age. And their first question is not answered directly. What Jesus does is he talks about the siege of Jerusalem, and we see him moving from early partial fulfillment to total fulfillment. So this is going to happen. It's going to destroy the temple. The second and third questions that they ask, the second question is, what would be the sign of his coming? What supernatural events are going to show us that Jesus is coming? And what would the sign be at the end of the age to announce the end of the age prior to his return? Well, the second and third questions, these questions I just covered, are answered in verse 4 all the way through the 41st verse of chapter 24. These verses describe the 7-year tribulation period which will precede Christ's glorious return. The first 3.5 years are described in verses 4 through 14. The final 3.5 years, known as the Great Tribulation and the time of Jacob's trouble, will be a time of unprecedented suffering for those on earth. Now, many of the conditions characterizing the first half of the tribulation have existed to an extent throughout human history, but will appear greatly intensified during the period of tribulation. Those in the church have been promised tribulation, but it's going to be far different from the tribulation which will be poured out on the world that rejects God's Son. Now, our position on the end times is that the church will be taken out of the world before the day of God's wrath begins. And in verse 4 and 5, it tells us that there will be many false messiahs who appear and will succeed in deceiving the multitudes. The current rise of false cults and prophets may be a prelude to this, because I'm seeing it all over the place. They have gifts, but they're not true preachers of righteousness. They have gifts that God has given them. And I mean, you'll be like, wow, he right up on it. He's talking to me. But yet they're not following after God. And so we've got to be careful and prayerful in these times. But this is a precursor. But this is not the fulfillment of everything that God says or Jesus says that will happen. These false religious leaders will be Jews claiming to be Jesus Christ. Verses 6 and 7 tells us there are going to be wars and rumors of wars. Nations will rise against nations and kingdom against kingdom. Now, it would be easy to think that we are seeing this fulfilled today, but what we see is mild compared to what it will be. We think what we see in Ukraine. We think what we see with unrest here and there. We even think what we saw with a certain fella trying to steal the election and cause anarchy and dictatorship and aristocratic, autocratic government here with the Trump administration. But that ain't the tip of the iceberg. That's just a little bitty top of the iceberg. That ain't even the tip. That's just the top. We haven't even begun yet. And actually, the next event in God's time schedule really is the rapture of the church. There is no prophecy to be fulfilled before then. After the church is removed, God's prophetic clock will begin, and these conditions will continue to manifest themselves. Famines, pestilences, earthquakes. They're going to occur in various parts of the earth. Even today, we are alarmed by the specter of famine due to population explosion. In the year 2030, we are, I think 2030 or 2050, there will be 9 billion people on the planet. We already have currently 6 billion. There'll be 9 billion, and there will be some shortages caused by wars, because we're going to be fighting, and it's going to disrupt the supply chain and the food supply. Some people think that time is now, but it's going to be a whole lot worse as time goes on. Earthquakes are attracting attention, but I'm going to tell you, there are bigger ones to come. Bigger ones to come. These are just straws in the wind, but not the actual fulfillment. It's sort of like these are the gurgling sounds of the eruption that is to come. The earth is basically having birth pains, which will bring forth a new order under the Messiah. And that's why they're in the book of Matthew, because this is the Messiah predicting his return to come back, the Savior of the world, his second coming. And he says, these things are not yet. No, not yet. These are just the beginning of the sorrows. People are going to be tried in religious courts. The nations will conduct a bitter hate campaign and start imprisoning people and start martyring people because they refuse to reject Jesus. And while these testings have taken place during various stages of the Christian testimony, this seems to have particular reference to the 144,000 Jewish believers who will have a special ministry during this period. Many people will commit apostasy. They will fall away from God rather than to suffer and die. Family members will betray their own relatives and turn them over into the hand of their persecutors. False prophets will occur, and they will convince people to go with them, and they will confuse people. False prophets are going to claim to be spokesmen for God. And we know that you're a fake prophet if your prophecy doesn't come true. And then if your prophecies do not lead people to God, but lead people away from God, then you are a false prophet. And false prophets are associated with the nation of Israel. In the church, the danger comes from false teachers. There are going to be false prophets to Israel, but in the church, there will be false teachers. Wickedness in verse 12 is going to be running rampant. Human affection will be less and less. You're going to say, how could people do such things to other people? Acts of unlove, acts of a hard heart are going to be commonplace. And I'm telling you, it's already starting. It's already starting. It already has begun. But there's hope. But he that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved. This simply says if people would hold on, there will be salvation. And so, and this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations. And then shall the end come. The end of what? The end of the age, not the end of the world. The Messiah will be here. Let's take a break from this, and let's let it sink in for this morning. We'll talk about in the next verses 15 through 28, the great tribulation. The great tribulation. And we'll get us to where we understand what I'm talking about. Jesus is saying it's going to get worse before I get back. And he wants us to understand the signs. That's why it's important for us to be spiritually transformed, so that when God comes for the church, he comes and finds a people without spot or without wrinkle. That's so important. That means I got to look at the way I talk. I have to look at the way I walk. I have to examine the way I think. I cannot treat people like I want to be treated. I have to treat people like God wants me to treat them. And we'll talk about this. The love of many waxing cold. We see it. We see it in our government. We see it in our personal reactions with people every day. God desires a sincere people that will allow him to change our minds and our hearts, our way of thinking, so that we can change our actions, so that our actions will bring glory to God, and that we can lay hold on eternal life and make it into the kingdom. I pray that this scripture, this text, Matthew 24 verses 1 through 14, will give us unique insight as to why we should ask God to change our lives and help us surrender to what he wants. Don't think this is going to be forever either, y'all. This will come to pass quicker than we expected. But nobody knows when the day or hour will come. That's why we've got to ask God to spiritually transform us so that we'll be ready. God bless y'all. God keep you this morning. I pray that all is well with you. And thank you for this time that we come together to discuss the beginning of the some of the things that's going to signal Christ's return. We'll continue the discussion at 6:30 this evening, Lord willing. God bless you. Love you. See you at 6:30.